Amendment number 1 relates to one of the core issues in this bill. There was a process underway. It was a lengthy process. There are aspects of the process which I believe have become outdated. For example, the process previously in terms of consultation and review that developing this bill in relation to raised bogs. That process happened before we had the strong focus that we have now in relation to climate change. We had our Taoiseach making statements just on Monday of how he hopes that Ireland will have a reputation in relation to its deep environmental concern. In that regard, I think it's unfortunate that this bill is taking place at the same time as the Climate Committee, and more crucially, and to the point, that this legislation is going through its final stages at a time just weeks before the Climate Committee are due to consider the issues of the future of our peatlands, hearing from Bord na Móna, hearing from experts in sustainable energy, hearing from the Parks and Wildlife Services in relation to National Peatland Strategy, hearing from experts from UCD and elsewhere. So we have, on the one hand, a process underway in relation to climate change and consideration of our peatlands in relation to climate change, and at the same time we have a bill that's going to make quite radical changes to the usage of our peatlands, which is going through just weeks before and therefore not able to be informed by the discussion of the Climate Committee. I say this, and this is relevant directly to this amendment because it relates to the question of process. There was a process, as I say, a process with gaps, a process that in some senses became outdated, but there was a process in relation to the question of raised bogs. There was a consultation. There was a Peatland Council review. Actions have been taken, documents have been published, opinions have been circulated, environmental assessment has taken place. In relation to blanket bogs, there has been no such process. And yet, at a late stage in the Dáil progress of this bill, blanket bogs were inserted and added into the bill. So we have a 12-year process for the raised bogs, and we have had effectively no process for blanket bogs, yet they will be opened for de-designation by this bill in the same way that raised bogs are being open. So this amendment, and it is important to take it separately because it relates to the fundamental purpose of the bill. And I am simply saying, while I disagree with the bill, at least let us insert the word raised and make it clear that it does not apply to all bogs. But it does apply, and let's be clear as well, when the current formulation, it applies effectively to all bogs in Ireland. Raised and blanket being the main concerns, but it is a wide open. Let us at least narrow the scope of the bill to its original policy intent, to that which is based on a process of some kind, and insert the word raised into the title. It's a particular concern in terms of blanket bogs, because we know that blanket bogs have a particular vulnerability in terms of drainage. They have different environmental concerns. They perform different environmental work. For example, the process of the review originally was to ensure that new raised bogs would be designated. And after this, there were stakeholders from the public consultation, and there was no mention in any of the engagement with the public of the potential de-designation of blanket bogs. I wanted to kind of just highlight one particular issue in relation to blanket bogs, is that the diversity of habitats and community of plants and animals that are there are quite different. And the Minister has given some acknowledgement later in this bill to the questions of the biodiversity and the idea of a review of. Does the Minister at least not agree that we should be looking at a full biodiversity review in relation to blanket bogs before we would proceed with including them under this legislation? As I've said, there are concerns. Well, I'll come to some of my other concerns later in relation to carbonation. I think there's opportunity to discuss on that. But I would like if the Minister could consider at this very late stage, but again, he added blanket bogs at a very late stage. Perhaps he might consider putting forward a separate piece of legislation, an appropriate piece of legislation in relation to blanket bogs, and narrowing the scope of this bill. And in this I'm appealing also to Fianna Fáil, because I know that it was a Fianna Fáil amendment that widened the scope at this time. And I would like to see if Fianna Fáil, given the environmental concerns that they have expressed and that their leader has expressed, if they would consider supporting a narrowing of this bill to limit its impact solely to the question of raised bogs. And all of these same issues, in terms of consultation, in terms of transparency, in terms of environmental assessment, all of these same issues are issues I put to Fianna Fáil in this regard, and I ask and urge, and that's why I want these amendments taken separately, because I hope this is in the title and it's at a symbolic point, but later I will be putting forward amendments in very, very meaningful and very impactful points around de-designation. And I hope that even at that stage and even at this late stage, Fianna Fáil may consider supporting amendments to have the removal of blanket bogs from this bill. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have these taken separately. As I say, at this point it is a symbolic point in relation to the purpose of the bill, but later we will come to the question of what can or cannot be de-designated, and I think that's a specifically important point. I'll conclude in that regard, but I will just notice the Peatlands Council set up 12 years ago, based on recommendations in the Quirk report. The Quirk report, again, a plan for managing raised bogs, was recommended by the Quirk report. So all of that consultation I mentioned came out of a report. And that report specifically, even the foundation documents on which the consultation was based, were based on a premise of dealing with raised bogs. Again, it's a huge expansion, Minister, and I think it will be one that will stand as a great shame for Ireland internationally, is the fact that we allowed blanket bogs to be de-designated without due process. And I know there is a subsequent process that you will be suggesting happens around designation. It's an inadequate process and certainly not comparable to the process that has been put underway in relation to raised bogs. Thank you.